Welcome to you all for our book launch on New Voices in Catholic Theology. My name is Eric Goldschmidt. I'm the director of the Church in the 21st Century Center, and we're excited to be here this evening. Over the past 10 years, the Church in the 21st Century Center has published an award-winning book series drawn from conferences and symposia that C21 has held on campus. The books are written to inform, to inspire, to renew the church and the Catholic community. And the topics include church management, sexuality, hope, marriage, and pastoral ministry. New Voices in Catholic Theology is the 12th book in the C21 book series. The content for this book grew out of a weekend symposium in 2009 in honor of the much-beloved theologian, Father Michael Buckley. The symposium gathered many of Father Buckley's students who then submitted papers for the book. So to release this collection of essays in proper fashion, we have the book's editors, Drs. Anna Moreland and Joe Curran, to share some reflections on this collection. In addition, we have one of the contributing authors to the book, Dr. Dominic Doyle, who's an associate professor in systematic theology at Boston College at the STM. And Dominic will introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you to the Church in the 21st Century for hosting this event. It's my great pleasure to introduce my friends and former doctoral colleagues from Boston College. Anna Bonta Moreland is an assistant professor in the Department of Humanities at Villanova University. She received her BA in philosophy at the University of Maryland, College Park, and her MA and Ph.D. in systematic theology from Boston College in 2006. Her areas of research include faith and reason, medieval theology with an emphasis on Thomas Aquinas, and the rise of modern atheism, and theology of religious pluralism. Her first book, which I just tried to get out from the library, but someone had beaten me to it, is entitled Known by Nature, Thomas Aquinas on the Natural Knowledge of God, published by Herder and Herder. She's working on her second book, What's Reason Got to Do with It? Contemporary Theologies of Religious Pluralism. And somehow, beyond my imagination, she's the mother of 4 children whilst accomplishing all this. So she's an impressive woman. Joseph Curran is the associate professor and chair of the Department of Religious Studies and the executive director of the Ethics Institute of Northeastern Pennsylvania at Misericordia University in Dallas, Pennsylvania. Dr. Curran received his PhD in theological ethics from Boston College, writing his dissertation on modes of moral discourse in the preferential option for the poor. His research interests include liberation theology, Catholic social teaching, and Catholicism in American political life. Joe was born and raised in New York City and now resides in Dallas with his wife and 2 daughters. He also added in his email to me that he brews his own beer and he roots for the Mets and the Jets. So I guess things cancel out. Who's going first? Anna.
Thank you. It's just wonderful for me to be back here at Boston College. I was really dewy-eyed driving up Comm Ave, and as I said to Lisa, I drove through Brighton, and nobody thinks Brighton is as beautiful as I do because I remember the years that I spent here as a graduate student. So I'm so happy to be back here today. Some years ago at the Catholic Theological Society of America, Grant Kaplan, who is a double eagle, and I, over a few beers, talked about how we wanted to honor Father Buckley's teaching and mentorship. Some years prior, his friends and colleagues had published a festschrift in his honor to note his publishing record and his contributions, his scholarly contributions to the church. Finding God in All Things is a testament to Father Buckley's significant work in the areas of fundamental theology, science and religion, and spirituality. Now, fresh rifts are a terrific way to honor somebody's academic achievements and to move those achievements forward into new developments in the field. But a serious scholar at a serious research university doesn't just shape a field. He shapes the next generation of those who will continue to till the land. Father Buckley prepared us in the less tangible but no less important field of the classroom. For Grant, for me, for Joe, for Dominic, for all of us, Father Buckley didn't just teach us. He shaped us into theologians who teach ex corde ecclesiae, from the heart of the church. In June of 2008, I wrote a letter to Father Leahy asking him to support a symposium in honor of Michael Buckley's teaching and mentorship, expecting not to get a response. Much to my delight, Father Leahy agreed generously and introduced me to the outrageously competent assistant director of the church in the 21st century, Karen Kiefer. In October of 2009, several of Father Buckley's former students came back to BC to honor him. The weekend began with a public lecture by Nicholas Lash. He told a packed Gasson 100 that Catholic Christianity is a lifelong school of friendship, holiness, and wisdom. And he offered Michael Buckley as the model teacher in that school. Now let me pause here and tell you a little bit about what it was like to be a student of Michael Buckley's. In the classroom, Father Buckley dragged us into great texts, and I mean drag. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae or Bonaventure's Itinerarium Mentis and Deum, and made us sit there quietly, devouring each word one by one. In his course on St. John of the Cross, for example, the entire first class session was dedicated to one word, and that one word was O. This was the first line in a poem, O Living Flame, that it begins, O Living Flame of Love, or O Llama de Amor Viva in the original Spanish. It took the entire class for us to digest the desire, the intimacy, and the longing in that one word, oh. I'm actually going to teach this poem, this text, in a couple of weeks at Villanova, and I'm trembling at the thought that I will not do it the justice that I haven't taught it before, that Michael Buckley, the way that he introduced us to that poem was really unforgettable. So I'm trembling. Father Buckley often made us tremble in the classroom. But in seeking not to disappoint him, we became closer readers of texts, more careful and analytical writers, and more eloquent doctoral seminar participants. My experience writing a dissertation under Father Buckley was the most intense academic experience of my life. I remember thinking when I finally reached my defense date that much like my marriage, writing my dissertation under Michael Buckley demanded that I become a much better at my work than I thought humanly capable. Outside the classroom, Father Buckley was responsible for hosting a weekly prayer group, monthly visits to a soup kitchen, and yearly Ignatian silent retreats. He also opened up the Jesuit Institute to his graduate students as a place to eat lunch together after daily Mass or just hang out between classes. So let's stop right here. My experience in graduate school at Boston College under Michael Buckley was radically different than most of my contemporaries. Most doctoral students at most universities are left to themselves to pursue their studies as isolated individuals. Michael Buckley knew that the future of the church in the United States would not include battalions of soldiers for Christ of the Ignatian order. He knew that his students could only become good theologians if they developed prayer lives that would sustain them in their work. He knew that they had to anchor their theology into the needs of the most vulnerable in our society. And he knew that we would fail if we didn't become theologians in communion with each other. Our weekly prayer group met at Robert's house, where upon arrival, we would find the Jesuits at cocktail hour. After evening prayer, we would eat pizza in the living room, mingling with the Jesuits who lived there or who were visiting there for a time. Those Thursday nights weren't just memorable for us doctoral students. Father Neenan has told me recently how much he looked forward to those nights. We must have looked pretty young then, and enthusiastic about the community of lay faithful that was taking shape right there at Robert's house. I will never forget our first silent retreat. On the first night of our first retreat, I'll admit, we were a little giggly. I, for one, had no idea how I was going to remain silent for 5 days straight. Father Buckley opened the retreat by standing up, looking around the room, and telling us that we had just entered sacred time. We were standing on sacred ground, and that basically it was up to us to screw it up. In just 2 minutes, he lowered the blanket of silence over that retreat house in Cohasset and frightened his ducklings into submission. He spent 6 years inducting us along the path of Ignatian prayer. We all know that the future of Catholic higher education is in peril. Jesuit universities enjoy an Ignatian vocabulary of prayer, however, that I am sure will sustain them in the challenging times ahead. Father Buckley taught us that in choosing to become theologians, we were choosing a way of life, a vocation. I can say with certainty that whatever we are as scholars, as teachers, as theologians, and most importantly, as human beings, we owe to Father Michael Buckley. In 2009, when we came together for a weekend to honor him, an interesting thing happened. We weren't just reminded how much he had shaped us, molded us into theologians in our own right. We became reacquainted with each other, scattered as we are throughout the United States, and realized that we want to continue to work in each other's company, supporting each other's work. The weekend was composed of 2 parts, the public lecture by Nicholas Lash that I've just mentioned, and an invited roundtable in which a few of Father Buckley's former students presented papers, and senior scholars from BC acted as respondents. One is right here, Fred Lawrence. We inverted the traditional conference panel format, where the junior scholars act as respondents. When the Church in the 21st century suggested that we write a proposal to the editors of this book series with Crossroad Herder, we embraced the opportunity to work again with each other, reigniting, really, our community of friendship and theological conversation. Both Joe and Dominic, who are here today, have read and commented upon drafts of articles and conference papers of mine since the Buckley Symposium a few years ago. Karen asked me to say a few words about my hope for this book, to speak about how I envision this book being used in the future. I think this collection of essays will contribute to the wider theological academy the way other collections have. I have met several theologians like Janet Soskus and Sarah Coakley of Cambridge, or Bruce Marshall of SMU, first in their essays in collections like these, and then in extended manuscripts and in conferences. Collected essays move the web of theological conversation forward in the academy in very important ways. Authors often test out ideas in these essays to see if they're worthy of book-length projects. In one of my conversations with the late John Jones, the editor, who was the editor at Crossroad Herder, who began shepherding this project to its completion, he mentioned that several of the essays read like the germ of book projects. In my case, I hope he's right. Students of theology will also, I expect, gain insight into pressing theological questions of today. Joe will speak more about the individual essays. But the point of the book is to move forward a series of questions that were shaped in some way by the work of Michael Buckley. I took 5 classes with Father Buckley. He directed my retreats and my dissertation. He presided at my wedding. I am not exaggerating when I say that I am indebted to him for who I am as a theologian, as a teacher and mentor of undergraduates, but most importantly, as a woman of faith. I speak for all the contributors of this volume in deep gratitude for his lifelong work in the Church and the Academy. And I thank BC, in particular the Church in the 21st century, for helping us to honor him in 2010 through this volume and finally this afternoon. Let me just end by saying that from where I stand, the C21 project has institutionalized and moves forward Father Buckley's spirit of theological inquiry and commitment to lay formation. Thanks to its work, the Ignatian vocabulary that is at the heart of Jesuit higher education will be transmitted to future generations. Thank you.
I should mention that there's a causal relationship. If you root for the Mets and the Jets, creating your own source of alcohol is advantageous at times. And I want to echo what Anna said, that it's such a pleasure to be back here. I walked through BAP's library, where I spent a lot of time when I was in grad school, and I was possessed by this overwhelming sense of panic that I had some unfinished work that I should find an empty table and just sit down and get to work on something. When we were talking about putting the volume together, we did not ask the individual contributors to focus on topics of our choosing. We asked the contributors to focus on topics of their own choosing. And really, we asked each person who contributed to the volume to take some aspect of Father Buckley's work or something related to it and identify a new problem or explore a new area of inquiry that was indicated by 21st century questions. And Father Buckley's broad theological interests gave us a lot of options. In the years that I worked for him, years that were only a fraction of his productive career, he wrote books and articles on Jesuit higher education, atheism, ecclesiology, Ignatian spirituality, mysticism, among other topics. Interestingly, none of Father Buckley's former graduate students chose to write about the issues explored in his book, Papal Primacy and the Episcopate. And this was a 1996 book that was an expansion of a paper that Buckley presented in Rome to a conference on Ut Unum Sint, John Paul II's encyclical on the Petrine office. This is relevant tonight because that conference was called, sponsored, and attended by the man who will, I assume, resume being called Joseph Ratzinger at 8 p.m. Rome time tomorrow. The conference was sponsored by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. So it's really too bad that nobody took on papal primacy and the episcopate in the volume. I'll note that in the book and the paper on which it was based, Father Buckley argued respectfully but firmly that ideology had too often driven the exercise of papal authority, and that a true study of the Petrine ministry required purity of heart and a renunciation of power and prestige, save that purely necessary for the greater glory of God. That's almost a direct quote. For me, this begs the question, did Michael Buckley plant the seed that led to the papal resignation? And I have no idea, but it's lovely to think that he might have had a small role. Nicholas Lash was the contributor who did take up the question of teaching and authority in the magisterium, and his chapter was an adaptation of the talk that Anna referred to before that he gave at the symposium. In that essay, Lash argues that the church must recover a more dialectical approach to teaching, contrasting this with the more oracular pronouncements that often characterize the exercise of the magisterium, particularly the Holy See. And this is an idea to which I'll return. Each of the rest of us then took on some facet of the broad range of Father Buckley's interests. Although there is little unity in subject matter, I would argue there is a striking and even instructional unity in approach and method. And looking at the essays now, I'm struck by their interdisciplinary approach, their commitment to dialogue, and their spirit of hope. The essays are interdisciplinary both within the subdisciplines of theology and in engaging other academic disciplines. The book includes essays that explore spirituality, ecclesiology, systematic theology, and church history, and ethics. I am an ethicist, a field that Father Buckley routinely dismissed as do good, avoid evil. And I enjoyed the privilege of being, as he put it, in charge of ethical things at the Jesuit Institute until Michael Moreland was also hired there. So among the systematicians who predominated in Father Buckley's classes and among his research assistants, I was something of an anomaly. However, his description of the role of care for the poor and concern for social justice as constitutive of the new humanism that must inform Jesuit and Catholic higher education in his book on Jesuit and Catholic higher education gave me a great deal to write about. Brian Hughes, in his essay, offers a constructive paradigm for understanding the relationship between theology and other academic disciplines, expanding more upon the work that Buckley began in the Catholic University as Promise and Project. Dominic Doyle argues that theology should look to the philosophy of Richard McKeon as the basis for a generous and intellectually rigorous approach to pluralistic discourse in his essay. In addition to this interdisciplinarity within theology, most of the essays also range outside of theology, engaging philosophy, history, sociology, literature, and, of course, musical theater. Among the exchange of emails during the editing process was a quest to locate a quote from Gilbert and Sullivan, a favorite of Buckley's, "O duty, 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 thou art no beauty, beauty, beauty." I think that was you, right, Dominic? In case you're wondering, it's from Gilbert's The Merry Zingara or The Tipsy Gypsy and the Pipsy Whipsy, which was news to me. So we have that interdisciplinarity, but it also goes hand in hand with a dialogic approach to theology. The authors of these essays are in dialogue with schools of thought and traditions within Catholicism and Christianity, but also with other religions and with secular movements. Christian Crocus, in his essay, mines the journey of the soul to God as explored by John of the Cross for insights that enrich interreligious dialogue. Anna's essay offers a critique of theologies of religious pluralism that neglect the role of reason in religion, with the aim of improving the quality and depth of pluralist religious discourse. Grant Kaplan's essay extends Buckley's dialectical account of the development of modern atheism, engaging secular thought in a dialogue rather than simply refuting it. Rich Miller argues that dialogue is the proper paradigm for understanding that most foundational relationship between the divine will and human freedom. And Jesuit John Montag, in his essay, is even willing to enter into dialogue with, God save us, the Dominicans, in his essay on the Jesuit school at Salamanca, showing that Jesuit education itself emerges from a creative dialectic with the Dominican tradition. Finally, I would say these essays seem to me to display a mature and deeply rooted hope, the kind of hope that Father Buckley would distinguish from a shallow or thoughtless optimism. Cara Anthony wants us to live better in communities that foster spirituality and social engagement, and her essay serves that end. Tom Kelly returns to the Second Vatican Council and reminds us how the conciliar documents radically reevaluated the role of the laity and energized the church. And Randy Rosenberg cheerfully takes up a task that even Buckley described as difficult and complex, developing a much-needed theology of sainthood. So when I think about what this all means, I would say my own observations are that these approaches, or this unity of approach, reflects that we were all trained to look beyond theology for dialogue partners, to seek out real problems and to tackle these problems with open minds and hopeful spirits. Intellectual academic problems come in many forms, and this was an important thing for Buckley. If you went into his office to talk about your latest paper or what your dissertation was going to be on, his first question would be, "What's your problem?" The problem is very important. So the places where work has not been done, where there is substantial disagreement among people of goodwill, in theology these problems appear where the church and the world have changed so that old settlements no longer make sense. As graduate students, we were taught to find these problems, to find these places where intellectual inquiry stumbles or stops, and pitch our tents and roll up our sleeves and do our work there. We were taught that this work required us to listen and dialogue with other academic disciplines, but also with other schools of thought and philosophies of life, and with the diversity of human experience. Father Buckley saw the value in honest, difficult conversation with Catholics, other Christians, non-Christians, and non-believers. And we were taught to do this with generosity and in a spirit of hope. I think this is important. The church today is a bit beleaguered. The Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate at Georgetown tells us that baptisms are down. The sex abuse scandal is an ongoing, epic disaster of pain and wounded morale. The arrival of universal health care that the U.S. bishops have been asking for 30 years or more became a bitter fight about the birth control mandate. The church and the culture seem too often to be locked in an ugly confrontation rather than a dialogue. In the coming years, the temptation will be to accept a smaller, more disciplined church, a church both less invested in and less likely to affect outcomes for the common good. So it seems to me that in these days, it is very important that the church take a dialogic approach to teaching, to continue to engage the modern world in all of its ambiguity and beauty and messiness. Within the disciplines of theology as well, we tend to retreat further and further into specialization and hardened ideological opinion. In these days, it seems to me very important that theologians engage not only other theologians, philosophers, and historians, but also secularists and unbelievers, to do so generously and inquisitively, to learn as well as to teach. This was how I was raised to be a theologian at Boston College, by Michael Buckley, but also by Michael Himes, Steve Pope, Lisa Cahill, David Hollenbach, Frank Clooney, Fred Lawrence, and others too numerous to mention. It was, as Paul Crowley so kindly wrote, a golden age. As a teacher, I have tried to emulate those who taught me to teach in the manner that Nick Lash describes, a mode of teaching that is much more difficult than simple stage-on-the-stage oracular pronouncements, but much more rewarding for student and teacher alike. One night during my second year at Boston College, Father Buckley was giving a talk on Jesuit spirituality at Gaston Hall. It snowed and attendance was low because of that, a hearty handful of graduate students and Jesuits. In fact, there were so many Jesuits that I felt like I was eavesdropping on an intimate family conversation about shared heritage and history. During the question period, one of his brother Jesuits asked Father Buckley about the vow of poverty. To understand the vow of poverty fully, Buckley said, you cannot look at the Jesuit who is working, and you cannot look at that one moment in his life. You have to look at the whole sweep and direction of his life. At the time, Father Buckley had books, computers, and a car that the California province gave him the use of so he could teach and write and get where he needed to go. But the dynamic of the life of a Jesuit, the life that is given structure by Ignatian spirituality, is that he gives himself away. When he no longer needs the books, the computer, the car, the Jesuit gives these away. He gives it all away until he has nothing left. And as he does so, God fills him up. It is the promise of Jesuit and Christian life. And so, Buckley told us, look to the Jesuit in the retirement home, in the infirmary, who is simply praying for the good of society and the church and the world. He has nothing, and yet he is happy, because that is what he was aiming for all along, and that is the meaning of Jesuit poverty. Last week, I spoke to Father Buckley, now living very much the life that he described on that night. He is still working on one more book, The Questions of Jesus in the Gospels, a lovely and lyrical project that we used to work on sometimes in the lull between other projects. He is still giving it all away. That is the pattern of Christian life and Jesuit life, and now, thanks in part to him, but also thanks to my wife and children, I can tell you that is the pattern of the life of a parent and a spouse. Happiness, deep satisfaction lie in giving it all away. And I saw that was the pattern of Father Buckley's life, including on that snowy night some 20 years ago, when he offered to drive a group of us graduate students home in the snow. Letting a California Jesuit drive you home in the snow in a Toyota hatchback when they haven't plowed the Boston streets yet, well, it was a religious experience because I expected to meet the Lord at any moment. I talked later with another graduate student who was there about how I thought that Buckley might have had some recruits for the Jesuits if he'd had piles of applications for the novitiate stacked up in the back of Gaston 100. At the time, I didn't really understand that that's not what he was trying to do. His intent was always to gain some thoughtful and dedicated young theologians, lay and Jesuit alike, to find and address future problems in the church with intellectual rigor, charity, and hope. And if we have done so at all effectively, we have much to thank him for. I invite you to read the book and see if we have. Thank you very much. And I think we can take questions now if anybody has any questions.
I can see that you are all lay theologians and that you are talking about Father Buckley educating a large number of lay theologians. So I would like to learn from you, how did he envision at a point in the history of the church when for the first time lay theologians were appearing and coming to the front, the mission of the lay theologian in the church in comparison to the theologians that had preceded the lay theologians. Did he have something to say about that? I would like to know.
Can you hear me okay? Okay. Well, I think what Father Buckley was trying to do was to provide us with some of the positive benefits that Jesuit formation provided for him and for his brother Jesuits. But he did that in a way that was not, he didn't try to make us into little Jesuits. He was very supportive of people's family life, very flexible in that regard. And also, I would say in thinking about things like, for example, the prayer group, he scheduled it at a time when people would be able to attend. It was once a week. He was encouraging us to have prayer lives. He saw many of us for spiritual direction, and the silent retreats that Anna mentioned were a big part of this. I had the feeling that it was kind of, I'm not going to say experimental, because that makes it sounds a little bit derogatory. I guess it was kind of experimental. In a way, he had recognized there was a need that part of this transition to having more lay theologians meant that there were going to be some changes, but I think he had identified some good things in Jesuit formation that he could pass on to us in a way that was not restrictive, and it didn't pretend that we weren't lay people, and I always appreciated that. People could talk to Father Buckley about the problems of family and about the joys of family, and he participated fully in that. And I think, to me, that was instructive. He saw that as a real grace. He believed, and he said to me on several occasions, I think you might have this experience too, that he thought it was going to be a great thing for the church that lay people were doing more theology, and that it would bring a dimension to that was important for the church and would be powerful for the church. So he really saw this as a good process, I think, that he was facilitating.
I would just echo what Joe has said. Okay, sure. I would echo what Joe has said. In particular, I don't know that Father Buckley had directed too many women theologians in dissertations, or had as many women students cry in his office as I did. I mean, for him, it was an experiment. I'm going to say that right now. He was learning as much as I was, maybe not as much, actually, absolutely not as much, but he was learning to do it along the way, but he did it really, really, really well for us. We gained a tremendous amount. But I would say it was a journey for him, too.
You mentioned the topics on which people wrote for this volume, and you said that their task was to look at something that had arisen in the 21st century, a new problem. And I'd just be interested to hear some of the content, like what are some new questions or new angles that the younger generation of theologians has as represented in this book? Either your own chapters or just some other ones, not necessarily all of them, but just some, new thinking or new directions.
I was not one of the editors of the book, but they've just asked me to speak about my...
We've just told him he's going to speak about it.
Talk about your own.
About my chapter. One thing that I was struck by when I came to Boston College was I was very influenced by Bernard Lonergan's thought, with Fred and all the wonderful Lonergan teachers here, and also by Buckley's work with Richard McKeon, his teacher at Chicago. Richard McKeon being the guy that was lampooned in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance as the tough chair of the committee. So to be honest, having done theological education undergrad at Cambridge with Eamon Duffy and then Harvard Div School, when I came to BC, I really felt for the first time I was getting an education in a way of reading texts that I hadn't had before in these two places. So I found in Buckley's methodology his appreciation of philosophical pluralism and theological pluralism. That was an encounter that I had that I hadn't had previously. There was an ability to, on the one hand, not sort of fall into a lazy pluralism and just the tyranny of tolerance, I think as David Tracy calls it. But on the other hand, really have a wide breadth of reading through all these different traditions that Buckley, as he used to say, the author becomes your teacher in these texts. So for me, personally speaking, there was an encounter with pluralism that maintained the integrity of the diversity of texts and authors you were treating, but also kept in mind the exercise of judgment and philosophical, theological assessment and evaluation, and not just a lazy pluralism. So in a culture, or especially a university culture, where diversity becomes a buzzword and be an excuse for lazy thinking, I found that approach particularly helpful.
So pluralism would be one challenge, I would say, that several of us tried to address in our essays. Also, the challenges of Catholic higher education, broadly speaking. We're all working in them and feel the changing landscape. So some of the some of the essays address those challenges. And also lay communities, the transfer from religious communities to lay communities, like Kara Anthony's essay in particular addresses those questions.
I wrote about Catholic higher education, and I teach at a Mercy school, Sisters of Mercy School, Misericordia University, and two things or two topics within Catholic higher education kind of came together for me. One of them was the issue of identity, and as there are fewer priests and nuns who teach in the schools, how does a Catholic school define itself as Catholic, and within Catholic as Mercy or Jesuit or Franciscan or whatever? And that's a live question at Misericordia. And I've also become interested in curriculum and looking at, we talk about education for justice, but how is that actually done, and what sorts of courses is that done, and how are they theologically analyzed, and how are they just sort of theologically taught? So I wrote about service learning and Catholic identity in higher education, but I also tried to, within that, to articulate a little bit of what I come to see now as the Mercy, the Sisters of Mercy charism, the Mercy identity within the Catholic identity.
I just had a reflection. In the last semester, there was a tribute similar to this to Bill Richardson in philosophy. Then this wonderful tribute, which has lasted a couple of sessions and years. But it says something about the vocation of the celibate Jesuit who was trained so well, spent so much time studying deeply, at the same time as having this fifth column of spirituality along with, and then in both cases making themselves so available in the formation of people who were not Jesuits, who would go on to all different kinds of schools and in some sense replicate them. But this is a tremendous legacy that we're going to miss, because family life in the present in the present day, it doesn't make you able to be so available in the same way. And then also the course of studies. It costs a lot to get educated, and therefore you have to learn so much in such a short time that what Richardson and Michael Buckley were able to do, it's just an extraordinary thing that you wonder what's going to happen when that, I hate to call it resource, but that wonderful vocation of the intellectual apostolate as incarnated by figures like that is no longer there.
Amen, brother. I mean, absolutely, there's nothing.
Don't get nervous, Karen. I want to thank you for taking on this vocation, for being in the places you are. It's a great hope for the church. How do you balance, for instance, trying to be prophetic and yet knowing that you have to think like the magisterium?
Yeah. That is a good question. How do you balance being prophetic and knowing that you have to think like the magisterium? Well, to answer it, I'm going to tell a story. When Father Buckley was invited to go to Rome to give this paper, he asked a number of people for advice, and a number of them told him not to go. And he had a reputation for being progressive, and he got in trouble for it. And he, there were fears among some of his friends and colleagues that this was some kind of trap, that it might go badly for him. And I don't think it ever really crossed his mind not to go. He is a man of the church, and he was asked to do something, and he was going to do it. The spirit in which he went, though, was very instructive for me as a theologian. It was a spirit of the assumption of goodwill on the part of all parties. He never believed or accepted the possibility that this was anything other than an honest, open attempt to ask his opinion about a sensitive topic, and that if they didn't want his honest, open opinion, they wouldn't have asked him for it. And he went in that spirit, and he gave his honest opinion, and produced a terrific little book. And I think, for me, that was instructive. I don't know that I always have to think like the magisterium, but I do have to be in dialogue with the magisterium, and that dialogue requires what Jesuits would sometimes call putting the plus sign, and assuming that this is, entering into that dialogue in a spirit of goodwill and with an open mind and a willingness to be converted. I think that that being prophetic doesn't mean that you're not listening to those who are threatened by prophecy or those who are opposed to the prophecy. So, for me, I think it is more about that dialogue, and also about that assumption of goodwill on the part of everyone concerned.
One insight I learned from Michael Buckley's big book on atheism, The Origins of Modern Atheism, was his historical study of the idea over time, how it developed in a certain context and evolved over time, over not necessarily a straight line of progress, but through the formation of new ideas in different contexts, then their sort of collapse and refragmentation in different forms over time. So I was very struck by how Buckley could say that tradition and change are not necessarily opposites, that any tradition to be alive has to be open to new questions, at least open to the possibility of change in new contexts. But also for change to be authentic, it has to be rooted in the tradition, in the theological tradition, in a life of prayer and so on. So for me, I found that an important take-home in terms of being rooted authentically in tradition, but also open to new questions and giving them a fair hearing. As Buckley used to say in an academic setting, and his latest book is on the questions of Jesus. And he used to say it's the quality of your question that will determine the quality of your answer, the product you put out. So I think his openness to questions and his sort of integrity and dedication to truth were a great example of mining the tradition, but in the spirit of being open to new questions.
Any other questions?
May I follow that up? I like your clarification about the traditional and the prophetic, and I love the question. I wonder if in writing this book and continue your work as theologians, you can perhaps make a sort of, if not a list, at least a description of what is the prophetic trend that we need at the present time in the church. I think that we are very much in need of prophets. And are you, as theologians, capable of reading into the theological work of lay and clergy people? What is the prophetic need of the time? What are?
Yeah.
That's a really big question. So I guess I just want to maybe recognize that in my particular university context, I'm at a really great university. I have a great department, very supportive in every way. But I don't think the challenge right now comes just from having to think with the magisterium, whatever that means. It comes from a university that's trying to be Catholic and doesn't know what that means either. So that doesn't just come from an issue with the magisterium. It comes from an issue internal to hiring practices for the past 40 years at universities, breakdown in conversations. I'm teaching an interdisciplinary seminar in the honors program now at Villanova, and it's a real challenge for me because I'm teaching with somebody in the English department and somebody in the history department, and we don't share an intellectual vocabulary. So I find that issue particularly challenging at not just my university, but in Catholic higher education today. And the magisterium has nothing to do with that issue. It's all us. It's all faculty issues.
Where I teach, about 45 or 50% of the students are Catholic, and that percentage has been going down gently for the past 10 years or so. Of the students who are Catholic, only about half of them, to me, anecdotally, really seem to be very much invested in being Catholic or knowing much about the church. I don't know how that compares to students at BC in percentage or temperament, but I've heard that elsewhere it's similar. And I think that one of the big challenges today, and I'm not sure I'd put it as necessarily a prophetic need, but is identifying the problem. Cardinal George wrote an op-ed in the Tribune a couple days ago, in the Chicago Tribune, suggesting that the modern intellectual culture made it more difficult for people to believe, and that it was more difficult to be a believer today. And yet, I hear from my students things that suggest that they really do want to believe in something, and that they have deep spiritual hungers. And even if they're not identifying these in the way that students of my generation or my parents' generation did, that I'm a sort of natural law trained Catholic ethicist, I think these are signs that God is operative in their lives in a way that is trying to bring them to some kind of belief. So I think the challenge for the church is to recognize those, to read the signs of the times, to recognize that maybe it isn't that it's more difficult to believe in this culture, but we are missing somehow the people who want to believe and are trying to believe with the message. That's what I think is the big challenge. The issue of Catholic identity at Misericordia has a lot of the challenges that Anna's talking about. I feel like we're in a pretty good place there because the sisters developed a very coherent understanding of what mercy identity was quite a while ago and have inculcated that in the lay people who work there pretty strongly. It's second only to the Jesuit sense of identity that I sense both here and at the University of Scranton when I worked there. But even within that, you have faculty and staff who are not Catholic, but who can be and will be invested in the Catholic mission of the institution, again, provided that they are brought into that in a way that they can understand, in a way that speaks to their concerns and their knowledge. So if are we going to look at the culture and say, this is a culture where it's difficult to believe, or are we going to look at the culture and say the desire, the yearning for belief is being expressed differently here, and we need to read that differently and respond to it differently?
Very briefly on the issue of prophecy and then the magisterium, there's our guild, the Catholic Theological, our guild of theologians, the Catholic Theological Society of America, its theme 2 years ago was prophecy. And I was struck how so many of the speakers talked about the theologian being prophetic, often against the magisterium, speaking out and so on, sometimes very bravely and whatever. But it struck me, one of the younger theologians said, actually the issue is not authority, but authenticity. Because younger people, do what they want to do anyway and vote with their feet about a lot of major issues that the magisterium teaches. So the issue is not authority, but authenticity. So I think the issue of being prophetic against the magisterium is not the concern today. It's how do you cultivate and show an authentic way of life that people will follow? Because this generation, a younger generation, is formed in ways that are so different in terms of the internet and questions of authority that it immediately will smell out anything that strikes of ideology or a claim to power or assertion. And so the issue is not how to reassert authority, but how to be authentic. And I think Catholic universities in America are incredibly successful at bringing young people to appreciate the liturgy, to attend Mass and cultivate a prayer life, to go on service trips and have an awareness, what Buckley called in his book on the Catholic University, a new humanism. It's not just a humanism refining our artistic, literary sensibilities, but it's also a sensitivity for exploitation, for the great questions of social injustice. And I think those issues a lot of people are very drawn to because they find them authentic places to exercise their discipleship. And the magisterium says a lot of good things about those too. So I think it's relativizing issues of authority and trying to bring to the forefront issues of authentic life in a world where there's, Lisa's written about this in her work on healthcare and so on, so much inequality and unfairness. That's something that Catholic universities do very well.
On that, so I want to say thank you to Anna, Joe, and Dominic for your wonderful reflection and tribute to Father Buckley. I want to thank Karen Kiefer as well for shepherding this book all the way through print. And you notice that the book's for sale in the back. And also just to point out that Anna has an essay in our latest C21 Resources magazine as well. So we very much appreciate your effort.